Hello and welcome to part 11 of our exploration of the Old Testament. Here we look at the exile of the people of Judah and the remnant of the people of Israel. It's not a long period that we're covering, less than 80 years, but what a traumatic period for the people of God. What was God doing that He allowed His beautiful temple, the place where His glory had resided, to be bulldozed, to be razed to the ground, and all the people to be taken in captivity to the pagan country of Babylon? Some were in despair. God had abandoned them. Others saw that this was God's judgment on them for their wickedness, their idolatry, their abandonment of their exclusive worship of Yahweh Himself. The prophets of this period had doom, doom, doom to pronounce, but were very clear that it was God punishing His people and that there would be a light at the end of the tunnel. There would be a chance for restoration. So, without any more from me at this point, let's begin our exploration of the exile. Thank you. The Babylonians swept the Assyrians aside. They formed a new empire. The Babylonian Empire didn't quite cover the same ground as the Empire of Assyria had done. But it wasn't a new empire. It had existed for nearly 2,000 years, having ups and downs where it came to prominence and then disappeared. A very old civilization. Their resurgence began under Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, who is actually Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar consolidated and began what few of the others had done, and that is mass deportations. It was their policy to move settled communities to new places, in that way to stir things up, to try to break old tribal loyalties, old national loyalties, and to form a kind of mix of races. The people of Israel and Judah were transported to around Babylon, as far as we know from the biblical evidence. Now, the Babylonians, once they'd brought the people to Babylon, allowed them to settle. They didn't keep them in captivity and slavery. They were allowed to build houses. They were allowed to form gardens and farms and to open businesses. And in fact, over the time that the people were in Babylon, some of them became very prosperous. They settled and never left. Here is just a look at the list of the Babylonian kings. Belshazzar, of course, that we know from the book of Daniel, Belshazzar's feast. He was son of Nabonidus and acted as his regent until Babylon fell, so he's never really king. It was a short-lived empire, lasting just around 80 years. But we're interested in what happened to the people of Judah and Israel, and that's what we're going to look at. There were 3 deportations, and the first one was in 597 BC, and that's covered in Jeremiah 52 verses 1 to 11, if you want to look that up. and Jeremiah covers the second deportation. And it is at the second deportation that Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed. In the first deportation, the temple walls had been breached, but it was the total destruction at the second deportation. And there was a third deportation a couple of years later. If we look at the prophets who were speaking around that time, of course we have Jeremiah, who covers the first two deportations and the destruction of the temple. Jeremiah's book is followed by Lamentations, a lament over the destruction of the city, a book that is sad and poignant to read. When we come to Ezekiel, we have a bit more problems because Ezekiel is not a linear book. The events shift backwards and forwards. For example, we have a shift between the deportations. It looks like Ezekiel visited the people in exile by the Kibar River sometime between the first and second deportations, because as by chapter 5, he's acting out the siege of Jerusalem before it happened. In chapter 10, the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah, departs from Jerusalem, but he said that God now is with his people, not in a way that he was in the temple in one fixed place, but he is among his people. So there is always that promise that he has not abandoned them forever. It is really from chapter 40 onwards of Ezekiel that he looks forward to the New Jerusalem. And of course, if we read the rest of the Bible, including the New Testament, that vision is still something that is a vision and has not actually happened. The New Jerusalem coming out of heaven, which is looked at in the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. Jewish settlements in Babylon were around roughly the city of Babylon, around the rivers that ran into who joined together, and it's around there that the city of Babylon was situated. As I've said, the people who were deported were first of all the cream of the crop, as if I can put it that way. There were the priests, the ruling elders, the people who were educated, and the people who were really the movers and shakers of Judah, and that continued. And as we'll see in the next part, all that were left were the poorest of the poor, the disabled, and others who moved in to take the place of vacant space. The Babylonians did not resettle people in Judah, so it was left really derelict. Providing that you honoured the gods, you could live peacefully. If you stood up and refused to worship the gods, then you could be in trouble, as we know from the book of Daniel, from Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who refused to bow down and ended up in a fiery furnace for Daniel, a lion's den for Daniel, and a fiery furnace for Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. As we know from chapter 1 of Daniel, he looked around and Nebuchadnezzar gave the order that the best of the young men should be trained in public service. And so Daniel and his friends are so trained. But though some settle down, like all refugees, they long to return back to their home. And here we have just a verse from Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down. There we wept when we remembered Zion. There was amongst the people a faithful remnant, the ones who hadn't worshipped idols, the ones who had kept faithful to Yahweh and looked for restoration. They longed to go back and rebuild and refound the worship in the Jerusalem temple. They saw that God's anger was justified, but they believed that he was a forgiving God and that he would indeed restore them, as Jeremiah had prophesied. This whole land will be left in ruins and will be a shocking sight, and the neighbouring nations will serve the king of Babylonia for 70 years. The fascinating thing is that those other nations really didn't survive, and yet the Jewish nation did. This is faithful remnant that scholars believe organised worship to keep the worship of Yahweh alive and collected together the sacred manuscripts that exiles had brought with them. And these would in time be collated by scholars and become eventually our Old Testament. Keeping faithful to Yahweh in the midst of pagan land was not easy. As I've said, the book of Daniel shows what happened to him and his 3 friends. And this is the important thing. The faith survived, and that's not got to be downplayed. It was severely tested and on trial for its life, and could, like many of the gods that people had brought into exile from other lands, could have disappeared into the sands of history, only to be recovered by archaeologists thousands of years later. No, it survived, and what's more, it was reformed, and we'll look at that much more fully in the next part. They did not disappear as other nations have disappeared, and the new nation that will be grow out of exile, in Ezekiel chapter 7, God said, shall be called Israel, and it shall be the tribes brought back together. That had happened when the tribes split after the death of Solomon. They will be brought back together again as one nation and would be called Israel. And it's at this period that we start to hear the word Jewish and Jew. And so some had faith and were determined that God would indeed keep his promise and restore them to their land. So, point us to Jesus. Well, in Daniel chapter 7 onwards, we have visions that Daniel has. And in Daniel 10:4-6, we have this vision of this figure, a man. But he's more than just an ordinary man. He is somehow a superhuman man in the way that he is, and he appears to Daniel and gives him a vision. We don't know who this powerful figure is until really we jump to the end of the New Testament, when we see him again at the beginning of the book of Revelation. Though we have a clue, because Jesus uses the title of himself in the Gospels. Let's look at that. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man many times through the Gospel accounts. Here we have 29 times in Matthew, 17 in Mark, 28 in Luke, and 12 in John. And taking with other things Jesus said about himself, it's not difficult to see that Jesus identified with the figure of Daniel. And in Daniel, and one quote we have here to suffice. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And of course, that is then filled out in chapter 1 of Revelation. The figure is never called Jesus in Revelation, but it's very clear who he is. And here's John's vision on the Isle of Patmos. I turned round to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was something like a son of man, dressed in a robe, reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. The figure then explains to John who he is. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. So it is quite clear that what the vision that, clear to me certainly, that the vision that Daniel has all those years ago in Babylon is fulfilled in Jesus and will come to its consummation at the end of time when the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven to earth. So, will Yahweh honor his promise and allow the exiles to return to Jerusalem? Daniel was sure he would. And so we shall explore that in part 12. How could that come about when this powerful empire was in control of so much land, including the land of Israel? We'll look at that, but enough for now. Thank you.